My 10-year-old son sent 5 kids to the hospital, and everyone is proud of him. The call came during my lunch break, the school nurse's voice tight with something between panic and awe. "Mr. Holloway, you need to come immediately. 5 children have been transported to county medical, and your son is involved." I dropped my sandwich and ran for my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. 5 kids. My son Caleb was 10 years old, skinny for his age, the kind of kid who still slept with a nightlight and cried during animal rescue videos. Whatever had happened couldn't possibly be what my mind was conjuring as I violated every speed limit between my office and Riverside Elementary. The parking lot was chaos. 3 ambulances still sat with open doors, paramedics loading equipment while parents screamed questions at school staff. I spotted Principal Vega standing near the entrance with 2 police officers, his face pale and drawn. When he saw me approaching, something flickered across his expression that I couldn't identify. Not anger or accusation, but something closer to stunned bewilderment. He directed me inside without speaking, and I followed the officer through hallways lined with confused students being herded back to classrooms by overwhelmed teachers trying to maintain order. The nurse's office smelled like antiseptic and fear. Caleb sat on the examination table with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, despite the room being warm. His glasses were cracked, one lens completely shattered, and his right hand was wrapped in gauze, showing spots of blood seeping through. He looked up when I entered, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. Not fear or guilt, but a kind of grim satisfaction that belonged on the face of someone much older. Someone who'd made a choice they knew would cost them everything, but had made it anyway. I knelt in front of him and asked if he was okay, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. He nodded slowly and told me he thought so, that his hand hurt, but nothing else did. The nurse, Mrs. Kapoor, pulled me aside and explained in a low voice that Caleb had injured 5 students, 1 critically, in what she was calling an incident on the playground. She said the details were unclear, but that Caleb had been defending himself and possibly others. The words sounded rehearsed, like she'd been coached on what to say and what to leave out. She glanced at Caleb with an expression I'd never seen on a school nurse's face before, something between respect and concern. Principal Vega entered with Officer Reyes and a woman in plain clothes who introduced herself as Detective Amara Foster. She had the kind face of someone who'd spent years working with children, but her eyes were sharp as she took in the scene. She asked if we could speak privately, and I looked at Caleb, who nodded and said I should hear what happened. The detective led us to the principal's conference room where a laptop sat open showing security footage from multiple angles. She warned me the content was disturbing before pressing play. The footage showed the playground during afternoon recess. I spotted Caleb immediately, sitting alone on a bench reading a book like he usually did. He'd always been solitary, preferring books to sports, observation to participation. Then 5 older boys approached him, and I recognized the one in front. Dominic Archer, 12 years old, held back twice, the kind of kid whose parents hired lawyers before the school could even call them about behavioral issues. I'd seen him bullying smaller kids before and reported it, only to be told by Vega that Dominic came from a prominent family who donated generously to the school. The boys surrounded Caleb, and even without audio I could see them taunting him. Dominic grabbed Caleb's book and threw it toward the fence. When Caleb stood to retrieve it, Dominic shoved him back down. The other boys laughed, forming a tighter circle. I gripped the conference table edge as I watched my son try to leave 3 times, each attempt blocked by the group. Then Dominic pulled something from his pocket, and Detective Foster paused the video to zoom in. It was a lighter. Dominic was flicking it open and closed, bringing the flame close to Caleb's face while the other boys held him in place. My vision tunneled as Foster resumed the footage. Caleb's body language changed completely in the next frame. He stopped trying to leave and went perfectly still, and I recognized that stillness from somewhere deep in my own childhood. That moment when fear transforms into decision, when you understand that surviving means fighting. What happened next unfolded so fast that Foster had to slow the playback to quarter speed. Caleb grabbed Dominic's wrist, twisted it in a way that made me wince, and sent the lighter flying. Then he moved. I'd never seen my son move like that. He wasn't wild or panicked. He was precise. He drove his palm into Dominic's nose with enough force that I saw blood spray across the frame. When the second boy grabbed him from behind, Caleb dropped his weight and threw him over his shoulder into a third kid. They both went down hard. The fourth boy swung at Caleb's head, but my son ducked and swept his legs, sending him crashing into the bench. The fifth boy started running, but Caleb caught him and drove his knee into the kid's stomach, doubling him over. The whole thing lasted maybe 15 seconds. When it was over, Dominic was on the ground holding his face. 2 boys were tangled together groaning, one was curled around his stomach vomiting, and the last was limping away clutching his leg. Caleb stood in the center of the carnage looking at his bleeding knuckles like he didn't recognize his own hands. Then he walked calmly to where his book had landed, picked it up, and sat back down on the bench to continue reading. He was still sitting there when teachers finally arrived, drawn by the screaming. Detective Foster stopped the footage and asked me directly if I'd taught Caleb to fight. I said no, that I didn't know where he'd learned those moves, that I'd never seen him display any kind of violence before. She pulled out a notepad and told me something that made my world tilt. Caleb's techniques were consistent with Krav Maga, an Israeli self-defense system used by military and law enforcement. Someone had trained him extensively, and that training showed discipline and control that didn't match the profile of a violent child. She asked again where Caleb might have learned those skills. I thought about the past 6 months, about Caleb's after-school activities. He'd been attending what I thought were art classes at the community center 3 days a week. His mother had enrolled him before she died 8 months ago, and I'd kept him going because it seemed to help with his grief. But I'd never actually been inside, just dropped him off and picked him up. I told Detective Foster this, and she made a note while exchanging a glance with Principal Vega that suggested they already suspected something. We went back to the nurse's office where Caleb waited. I asked him directly about the art classes, and he looked at me with those two old eyes and said they weren't art classes. They were self-defense training. Mom had signed him up after she got sick, after she knew she wouldn't be around to protect him anymore. She'd made him promise not to tell me because she knew I'd object, knew I'd say 10 years old was too young for that kind of training. Caleb's voice cracked when he explained that Mom had told him some people wouldn't fight fair, and he needed to know how to protect himself when nobody else could. The instructor's name was Elijah Soto, a former Israeli Defense Forces combat instructor who ran a small studio in the community center's basement. Detective Foster looked him up on her phone and showed me his website. The studio specialized in teaching vulnerable populations, children with disabilities, victims of abuse, anyone who needed real defense skills rather than sport martial arts. Foster said she'd need to interview Soto, but from the footage, he'd trained Caleb exactly as advertised. Those weren't aggressive techniques. They were designed to neutralize threats efficiently and escape. Principal Vega cleared his throat and explained why 5 children were in the hospital. Dominic Archer had a broken nose and fractured orbital bone that required surgery. 2 boys had concussions from hitting the ground. 1 had a dislocated shoulder. The 5th had fractured ribs from Caleb's knee strike. Vega's voice was carefully neutral as he listed these injuries, but I caught the edge of something else underneath. He said the school board was meeting an emergency session to determine Caleb's consequences. That assault of this severity typically meant expulsion and criminal charges regardless of provocation. I felt my own rage building then. I asked Vega if he was seriously considering expelling my son for defending himself from 5 boys, 1 armed with a lighter, after Vega's own administration had ignored my reports about Dominic's bullying for 2 years. The principal's professional mask cracked slightly, and he admitted that Dominic's parents were already threatening legal action against the school and our family. Gerald and Patricia Archer were both corporate attorneys who'd made it clear they'd bury us in lawsuits unless Caleb faced consequences. Vega looked exhausted as he explained the political reality, that sometimes doing the right thing wasn't possible when money and power aligned against you. Detective Foster interrupted to say that while she understood the school's position, the footage showed clear self-defense and defense of others. Under state law, Caleb had the right to use reasonable force to protect himself from imminent harm. She'd be recommending no criminal charges, but that didn't prevent civil liability or school discipline. She looked at me with something like sympathy and said I should lawyer up immediately. The Archers had resources and connections, and they'd use both to make an example of my son. Over the next 3 days, the situation metastasized beyond anything I'd imagined. The Archers hired Donald Kessler, the most aggressive litigation attorney in the county, known for destroying opponents through sheer financial attrition. He filed a $1 million lawsuit against us, alleging assault, battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He filed complaints with Child Protective Services claiming I'd trained Caleb as a weapon. He got a restraining order keeping Caleb away from Dominic, which effectively banned my son from school since they were in the same grade. The legal paperwork arrived faster than I could read it, each filing more devastating than the last. I used my savings to retain Angela Kwan, a defense attorney recommended by Foster. Angela was young but fierce, the daughter of Korean immigrants who'd built her practice defending underdogs against corporate bullies. She reviewed the footage and told me we had a strong case, but strong didn't mean easy. The Archers would drag this out for years if necessary, bleeding us financially while isolating Caleb socially. She said our best hope was getting public opinion on our side before the narrative became fixed. I asked how we did that, and she pulled out her phone to show me what was already happening online. Someone had leaked the security footage. The video had gone viral, shared across social media platforms with competing narratives. Some people called Caleb a trained fighter who'd used excessive force against children. Others praised him for standing up to bullies when adults failed to protect him. The comment sections were war zones, with strangers arguing about appropriate self-defense, school safety, and parental responsibility. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines that ranged from "Trained fighter hospitalizes 5 in playground attack" to "Boy defends himself after school ignores bullying." The local news showed up at our house within hours. I refused to comment on advice from Angela, but that didn't stop them from running stories. They interviewed Dominic's parents on their manicured lawn, Patricia Archer crying about her son's broken face, while Gerald spoke in measured tones about violent children and parental negligence. They looked like victims, polished and sympathetic, while I was just a grieving widower who couldn't afford their level of media coaching. The narrative was forming exactly as Angela had feared, with the Archers controlling the story through superior resources. Then something unexpected happened. Parents started coming forward, not just from Riverside Elementary, but from Dominic's previous school and the private academy he'd attended before that. They brought stories of bullying, harassment, and violence that had been swept under administrative rugs by families too scared or too exhausted to fight the Archer family's legal threats. A mother named Veronica Russo spoke on camera about her son's broken arm, attributed to a fall, but actually inflicted by Dominic during a confrontation the school had covered up. She'd been too intimidated to press charges then, but watching Caleb's video had given her courage to speak truth. More families emerged. A father described his daughter's therapy bills after Dominic's systematic psychological torment drove her to self-harm. Another mother showed medical records from her son's concussion that the school claimed was accidental. A pattern emerged of Dominic targeting vulnerable children, using his family's position to avoid consequences while administrators looked away. The Archers had donated over $200,000 to the school district in the past 5 years, enough to influence policy and silence complaints. Dominic had learned early that money could buy immunity from accountability. Principal Vega was forced to address these allegations in a press conference that went poorly. He stammered through prepared statements about taking all complaints seriously, while admitting under questioning that multiple reports about Dominic had been filed and dismissed. A reporter asked directly if the Archers' donations had influenced administrative decisions, and Vega's pause before denying it told the real story. The school board announced an investigation into the handling of bullying complaints, but the damage to their credibility was done. Elijah Soto agreed to be interviewed by local news, and his appearance changed the narrative completely. He was composed and articulate, explaining his mission to teach self-defense to children who faced violence in environments that should protect them. He described Caleb as a dedicated student who'd trained 3 times weekly for 5 months, learning techniques specifically designed for smaller people to defeat larger attackers. Soto emphasized that every lesson included de-escalation training, that his students learned when not to fight before learning how to fight. He'd reviewed the footage and concluded that Caleb had done exactly what he'd been taught: avoid, escape, and only engage as a last resort when facing imminent danger. Soto revealed something I hadn't known. My wife Sarah had paid for an entire year of lessons up front, along with a letter explaining why Caleb needed these skills. Soto shared portions of the letter on camera with my permission. Sarah had written about her terminal diagnosis, about her fears for Caleb's safety after she was gone, about noticing Dominic targeting her son and knowing the school wouldn't protect him. She'd researched Soto's program for months before enrolling Caleb, specifically seeking training that emphasized defense over aggression. Her final words in the letter were that she couldn't shield Caleb forever, but she could give him the tools to shield himself. The letter went viral. Sarah's foresight from beyond the grave became the emotional core of the story, a dying mother's last act of love for a vulnerable son. Public opinion shifted dramatically overnight. The Archers found themselves facing hostile crowds outside their home, people holding signs with Dominic's victims' names and demanding accountability. Patricia Archer made the mistake of speaking to a reporter without legal counsel present, dismissing the other family's stories as exaggerations and suggesting that Sarah had weaponized her son. That soundbite destroyed what remained of their public sympathy. The school board's emergency meeting about Caleb's expulsion became a public referendum on systemic failure. Over 300 people packed the auditorium, most wearing blue shirts that said, "Protect our kids," in solidarity with Caleb. Parent after parent spoke during public comment, detailing how the administration had failed to address bullying while protecting wealthy donors. Teachers broke ranks to admit they'd been instructed not to document incidents involving Dominic. A school counselor resigned during the meeting, citing moral conflict with policies that prioritized donations over student safety. When it was my turn to speak, I brought the hospital report from Caleb's visit after the incident. The doctor had documented defensive wounds, bruising on Caleb's arms consistent with being grabbed and held, burn marks on his forearm from where the lighter had made contact before he'd disarmed Dominic. Evidence that my son had been tortured, not just threatened, in the seconds before he'd fought back. I held up enlarged photos of these injuries and asked the board directly whether they believed a 10-year-old boy should have submitted to being burned rather than defending himself. The board voted unanimously not to expel Caleb. They placed him on administrative leave pending completion of the investigation, but acknowledged that preliminary findings supported his account of self-defense. Principal Vega announced his resignation effective immediately, accepting responsibility for systemic failures during his tenure. The district superintendent committed to implementing new anti-bullying protocols and mandatory reporting procedures. It felt like victory, until Angela pulled me aside and explained that the civil lawsuit was still active and the Archers weren't backing down. Donald Kessler proceeded with discovery as aggressively as Angela had predicted. He demanded every record related to Caleb's training, his school history, my parenting decisions, even Sarah's medical files from her final months. He deposed Elijah Soto for 8 hours, trying to prove that teaching self-defense to children constituted training them as weapons. He hired expert witnesses who would testify that Caleb's response was disproportionate to the threat, that a trained fighter had a responsibility to use less force. Kessler's strategy was transparent: bury us in process until the financial burden forced settlement. Angela countered by filing our own lawsuit against the Archer family and the school district. We alleged that Dominic's pattern of assault, enabled by administrative negligence, had created a hostile environment that violated Caleb's civil rights. We sought damages for emotional distress, medical expenses, and the cost of private tutoring since Caleb couldn't attend school. Most importantly, We demanded a full accounting of the Archers' donations and any correspondence suggesting quid pro quo arrangements with school administrators. Angela said we might not win, but we'd make the discovery process expensive for both defendants. The depositions were brutal. Patricia Archer cried throughout hers, portraying herself as a devoted mother blindsided by accusations against her son. Gerald Archer was cold and calculated, admitting nothing while suggesting everything was the result of jealousy from less successful families. Dominic's deposition lasted only an hour before his attorneys ended it. The kid showed no remorse, describing the playground incident as mutual combat and claiming Caleb had attacked him unprovoked. His lies were confident and well-rehearsed, the performance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. Caleb's deposition was harder to watch than I'd expected. Kessler tried every tactic to break him, suggesting his mother had taught him to solve problems with violence, insinuating that I'd encouraged the fight, asking repeatedly whether he'd enjoyed hurting those boys. Caleb answered each question in a monotone, his affect completely flat, until Kessler made the mistake of calling Sarah's decision to enroll him in self-defense classes, reckless parenting. My son looked directly at the attorney and said in a clear voice that his mom had saved his life, that without her foresight, he'd have been burned and beaten while adults debated liability. The raw truth of it silenced even Kessler for a moment. The turning point came from an unexpected source. One of the boys Caleb had fought, Kenneth DuPont, told his parents he wanted to change his story. Kenneth was 11 and had been following Dominic's lead for years, too scared to refuse and too weak to object. After spending a week in the hospital with a concussion, he'd had time to think about the person he was becoming. His parents contacted Angela and arranged a meeting where Kenneth admitted everything. Dominic had planned the attack specifically to humiliate Caleb, had brought the lighter with intention to burn him, had promised the other boys protection from consequences because his parents always fixed things. Kenneth's testimony was devastating to the Archers' case. He described previous incidents where Dominic had hurt other kids and his parents had paid off families to avoid charges. He named specific administrators who'd taken money to bury complaints. He revealed that Dominic kept trophies from his victims, items stolen during attacks that he displayed in his bedroom like a hunter's collection. Kenneth's parents corroborated his story and agreed to testify despite knowing the Archers would retaliate. They said their son's conscience was worth more than their comfort. 2 more boys came forward after Kenneth, each telling similar stories of coercion and cover-ups. The Archers' legal position crumbled as the conspiracy they'd built over years unraveled in sworn testimony. Kessler tried to discredit the boys as coached witnesses, but their accounts were too detailed and consistent. Angela filed for summary judgment, arguing that no reasonable jury could find Caleb liable when 5 conspirators had planned and executed an assault with a weapon. The judge agreed, dismissing the Archers' lawsuit with prejudice and awarding us attorneys' fees. The criminal investigation that followed targeted the Archers and several school administrators. Dominic, as a juvenile, faced charges in family court for assault with a weapon. His parents faced conspiracy charges for their role in covering up his pattern of violence. Principal Vega and 2 board members were charged with accepting bribes to influence official actions. The superintendent resigned under pressure, and the entire district administration was placed under state supervision. What had started as one boy's self-defense had exposed institutional corruption that had flourished for years. The trial became national news. Court TV covered it live, and legal analysts debated parental liability for children's violence and institutional responsibility for enabled abuse. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of the conspiracy, including emails between Patricia Archer and administrators discussing specific payments tied to specific incidents. Text messages between Dominic and his victims showed premeditation and sadism. The lighter he'd used was introduced as evidence, still containing his fingerprints and trace amounts of Caleb's DNA from where the flame had touched his skin. Dominic was convicted of aggravated assault and sentenced to juvenile detention until age 18, followed by intensive probation and mandatory therapy. His parents were convicted of conspiracy and obstruction, receiving suspended sentences contingent on community service and restitution to victims. Principal Vega pleaded guilty to bribery and lost his education license permanently. The board members who'd accepted payments resigned in disgrace. The district settled our civil suit for $300,000, which we placed in trust for Caleb's future education. The publicity had unexpected consequences. Elijah Soto's studio became overwhelmed with enrollment requests from parents who wanted their children trained in practical self-defense. He hired 3 additional instructors to handle demand and opened a second location. He invited Caleb to train for free for life and asked permission to use the story in promotional materials. Soto said Caleb represented everything the program was meant to accomplish, a vulnerable child given tools to protect himself, who used those tools responsibly only when necessary. Other self-defense instructors reached out wanting to study Caleb's case. They said the footage had become a teaching tool for demonstrating appropriate force in asymmetric conflicts. University researchers requested interviews to study the psychology of trained children facing violence. A book publisher offered a contract for our story. All of it felt surreal. This attention for something that should never have happened. Fame for surviving what should have been prevented. Caleb struggled with the aftermath in ways I hadn't anticipated. He'd been celebrated for violence, even though the violence itself had traumatized him. He had nightmares about the fight, woke up crying about whether he'd hurt those boys too badly. The therapist explained that Caleb's training had created a disconnect between capability and willingness, that knowing how to hurt people didn't make hurting them easier emotionally. She said his nightmares were actually healthy, evidence that he hadn't become desensitized to violence despite being forced to use it. We spent months in family therapy, processing Sarah's death and Caleb's fight as intertwined traumas. I realized I'd been so focused on practical survival after losing my wife that I'd missed Caleb's emotional drowning. He'd been training for violence while grieving his mother, learning to fight while learning to be alone. The self-defense skills had saved him physically, but isolated him emotionally, creating a barrier between him and peers who couldn't understand what he'd experienced. The therapist helped us build new connections, find communities where Caleb's experience was understood rather than sensationalized. The other families who'd lost children to Dominic's violence reached out, and we formed an informal support network. Monthly meetings, where parents shared stories and kids connected with others who understood bullying's long shadow. Kenneth DuPont became Caleb's unexpected friend, the two boys bonding over their shared experience from opposite sides. Kenneth's parents thanked me repeatedly for Caleb's actions, saying their son had been saved from becoming what Dominic had tried to make him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that violence had created this community of healing. A year after the incident, Riverside Elementary invited Caleb back with new administration and reformed policies. The school had implemented mandatory anti-bullying training for all staff, created anonymous reporting systems monitored by outside advocates, and established a victims fund for families affected by previous administrative failures. They asked Caleb to speak at an assembly about his experience, and he initially refused before the therapist suggested it might provide closure. I left the decision to him, and after a week of consideration, he agreed. The assembly was packed with students, parents, and media. Caleb stood at the podium looking small behind the microphone, his cracked glasses now replaced but his hands still showing faint scars from that day. He read from prepared remarks, his voice steady, as he explained that he didn't want to be famous for fighting, didn't want other kids to think violence was cool or necessary. He said his mom had given him self-defense training as a last resort, insurance for the worst-case scenario she'd hoped would never happen. He wished adults had protected him, so he didn't have to protect himself. Caleb looked directly at the students and said something that made the room go silent. He explained that beating up 5 kids hadn't made him feel strong, it had made him feel terrified and alone. That knowing you're capable of hurting people is a burden, not a power. That every night he wished he could have walked away, wished teachers had been watching, wished Dominic had chosen differently. He said the scars on his hands would fade, but the memory of what he'd done wouldn't, and he'd carry that weight his whole life, even though everyone told him he'd been right to fight. The assembly ended with a standing ovation that felt wrong to me. These people were applauding my son's trauma, celebrating his forced maturity, turning his survival into inspiration. But when I looked at Caleb's face, I saw something else. Not pride or satisfaction, but relief that he'd been heard. That someone had finally acknowledged the cost of what he'd survived, instead of just praising the outcome. That validation seemed to matter more to him than any legal victory or public support. We left Riverside Elementary that day and never went back. Caleb transferred to a small private school with strict anti-bullying policies and a student body small enough that every kid was known and monitored. He continued training with Elijah Soto, but focused on forms and discipline rather than combat. Application. He joined the school's debate team and discovered he was good at arguing positions with words instead of fists. Slowly, carefully, he began building a new identity around something other than that 15 seconds of violence. The legal settlements paid for therapy and private school tuition, but more importantly, they funded a foundation Sarah had mentioned wanting to create before she died. The Protect and Empower Foundation provided free self-defense training for at-risk children and advocacy for bullying victims. Angela Kwan sat on the board, as did Elijah Soto, Veronica Russo, and Kenneth DuPont's parents. We awarded grants to schools implementing evidence-based anti-bullying programs and hired attorneys to represent families too intimidated or too poor to fight back against institutional failures. Dominic Archer was released from juvenile detention after 3 years of intense therapy and restorative justice programming. Part of his release conditions included writing apology letters to each of his victims and meeting with them if they agreed. Caleb declined the meeting, but read the letter Dominic sent. It was long and detailed, acknowledging specific incidents and accepting responsibility without excuses. Caleb never responded, but he kept the letter in his desk drawer. When I asked why, he said it reminded him that people could change, that the boy he'd fought wasn't the same person anymore, that maybe the system had worked after all, just not in the way anyone expected. Years later, when Caleb was 16 and applying to colleges, he wrote his admissions essay about that day. Not about the fight itself, but about his mother's final gift and the burden of being trained to survive violence. He wrote about learning that strength wasn't measured in fights won, but in fights avoided, that real courage meant living with the consequences of necessary actions, rather than celebrating them. He submitted the essay to his top choice, a school known for social justice advocacy and conflict resolution programs. They accepted him with a full scholarship and a note from admissions saying his perspective on violence and protection was exactly what they needed in future leaders. The day we dropped Caleb off at college, we visited Sarah's grave for the first time in months. I told her out loud that her plan had worked, that Caleb had survived and thrived despite everything, that the self-defense training she'd bought had saved him that day, but her real gift had been teaching him that survival wasn't enough, that he needed to build a life worth protecting. Caleb stood beside me and said simply that he wished she could see who he'd become, that the scared kid she'd worried about had found his courage not in fighting, but in choosing when not to fight. 10 years after that playground incident, I received a message from Kenneth DuPont. He'd become a social worker specializing in juvenile intervention, working with kids who'd been bullies or victims, to break cycles before they became permanent. He said Caleb's willingness to forgive him, to see past that day to who Kenneth could become, had changed his life's trajectory completely. He wanted Caleb to know that the 5 kids who'd gone to the hospital that day had all become better people because of what happened, that sometimes the most violent moments plant seeds for the most profound growth. Caleb read Kenneth's message and smiled for the first time in days. He'd been stressed about his graduate school applications, worried that his past would define his future. But Kenneth's words reminded him that the past wasn't a cage, it was context. That the boy who'd fought 5 attackers at 10 had become a man who dedicated his life to preventing fights, and that transformation was what mattered. Not the viral video or the lawsuits or the fame, but the choice to turn trauma into purpose, survival into service, and violence into advocacy for peace. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.